The sun had only just cleared the hills when the horse reached the edge of the field. She moved slowly, not from age or injury, but from habit. Everything she did was deliberate, step by step, with careful weight on the soft ground. Her hooves made almost no sound. The frost on the grass had already begun to melt under the first touch of light. She paused near what was once a fence. The posts were still there, though crooked, some leaning, some broken. The wood was weathered to the color of old ash. Rusted nails jutted out like forgotten teeth. The rails had fallen long ago, swallowed by weeds and tall grass. But the horse remembered where the boundary had been. She wasn't wild, though no halter hung from her head and no bell followed her steps. Her coat was thick with winter growth, a dusty brown, roughened by time. White hairs marked the edges of her muzzle and above her eyes. Her mane was long and uneven, tangled with bits of grass. She stood still beside the broken fence, ears twitching toward every shift in the morning air. A crow called from the old barn in the distance. One wall had collapsed in on itself. The roof sagged where snow had once rested too long. But the horse didn't look at the barn. She kept her gaze fixed on the field beyond, the open space where she had once run. There were other animals now. A pair of deer moved along the opposite edge, stepping lightly. Farther off, a fox passed low through the brush, its tail raised but body wary. They watched her, but didn't fear her. She had been here too long, part of the place, familiar. She lowered her head to graze, not from hunger, but from rhythm. The act itself was calming. The pull of grass, the feel of it between her teeth, the quiet. Wind passed over the field in slow waves. The trees didn't move much, but the grass leaned just enough to suggest something listening. She raised her head again and turned slightly toward the north fence line. The gate was gone, but the path was still there, faint but visible. A worn line between patches of rye and burrs. She took a step forward. Behind her, the frost melted. A hoofprint softened into the dirt. The field held it, just like it had held all the others. Years ago, when more horses ran here, when voices echoed from the barn, and smoke rose from the chimney that now stood alone in the cold. But the land didn't forget. And neither did she. The old gate had once stood tall, iron-framed with thick wooden planks, reinforced by heavy hinges sunk deep into the fence posts. It had creaked loudly when it opened, always on the same rhythm. 2 short groans, 1 long. The kind of sound that stayed in memory longer than the gate itself. Now only the posts remained. The left one leaned forward slightly, its base rotted where it met the soil. The right still stood upright, though the wood was split from decades of cold and sun. Between them was only air and a scatter of broken weeds. But the horse stopped just before them, the way she always had. She stood still, head level, ears turning toward the wind. Her body showed no tension, no fear, just recognition. Memory locked in muscle. For a few moments, she didn't move. Then, as if waiting for something unseen to pass, she stepped forward through the empty space where the gate used to swing. The path beyond was narrower now. Grass had grown over the packed earth. Brambles reached in from the sides. Low, dry stalks scratched her legs as she walked, but she didn't mind. Her hide was thick. Her pace was steady. Here, she passed by a row of stones, once the base of a trough, now moss-covered and half-buried. Birds fluttered up from the brush ahead, a pair of blackbirds and a jay. They scattered noisily, wings flashing. The horse didn't react. She had shared space with birds her whole life. They came and went, always in motion, never still long enough to mean danger. To her left, a stand of bare apple trees leaned over the path. Most no longer bore fruit. A few still tried each summer. Small, wrinkled green spheres, quickly taken by wasps and ground squirrels. She passed beneath their branches and exhaled softly. Somewhere far behind her, a tractor buzzed. A modern sound, mechanical. It didn't belong here. The horse flicked her ears and kept moving. The air carried the smell of dry earth and distant smoke. Not fire, but maybe someone burning leaves in a nearby field. The scent triggered something deep in her, but not a clear memory. Just a feeling. The kind that lived beneath words. one that said, "You've smelled this before," when things were different. She reached a wide clearing. It had once been the center of the paddock. Here, the grass was short, patchy. In the middle stood a single wooden post, almost rotted through at the base, its top still bearing the rusted ring of a tie line. She approached it and stopped. The wind moved again, across the empty pasture over the brush, through the broken gate behind her. The field was silent, except in the wind, if one listened closely. It almost sounded like the faint creak of wood on metal, but only for a moment. Then it was gone, and the gate, once again, did not swing. The trail curved gently between two low ridges. In spring, the grass here would turn a rich, pale green. In summer, wildflowers dotted the edges, clover, yarrow, and stiff-stemmed goldenrod. But now, deep into autumn's end, the color had faded. The stems were dry, some already broken under wind and frost. Still, the path remained. The horse followed it. Her stride had changed, not hurried, but purposeful. Her hooves struck the packed earth softly, as if measuring the trail beneath her. There was no scent of others, no horses, no humans, no dogs, just the quiet press of old places, remembered not with thought, but through the body. She had walked this trail many times before. Years ago, it had led to the far pasture, the largest of them. Once used for training, then later just for grazing. It was where the fences had been strongest, the grass most lush, and the ground most even. But even then, it hadn't been the field itself she remembered. It was the movement. Back then, her muscles had been tighter, her breath sharper. The world was bigger, faster. She had galloped along this trail, sometimes alone, sometimes led, sometimes followed. She had kicked dust into the air. Her tail flagged in wind. Her ears had fixed forward with focus. Now she walked the same trail at a different rhythm. There was no pressure in her stride, no audience, no reward. Just the sound of her own movement and the dry hush of wind along the stems. Halfway down the path, she paused. To the side, beneath a slanted oak, stood the old salt block, or what was left of it. The metal frame that once held the mineral stone was rusted, and the block itself was just a sunken gray remnant worn smooth. No hoofprints surrounded it now, but she remembered the spot, the taste, the way others used to jostle for space. She did not approach, only glanced, then turned back to the trail. A red-tailed hawk passed overhead. Its shadow glided over her back and vanished into the brush ahead. She raised her head slightly to follow it, then resumed walking. Ahead, the trees grew denser, and the trail dipped toward the lower field. It was here, years ago, that her world had once opened wide. The fence lines ended, the sky grew bigger, and legs, her legs, had carried her fast and hard across the soft dirt. The memory wasn't sharp, but her body shifted slightly, as if preparing. She didn't run. But for a few moments, her steps quickened. Her nostrils flared, her neck arched with subtle strength, and her hooves struck the trail with a rhythm that echoed something old. Then, gradually, she slowed again. The trees closed in, the sky narrowed, and the last trail she remembered folded back into quiet. At the bottom of the slope, the trail disappeared. Not abruptly, but gradually, fading into uneven earth where the grass had grown high and thick. There had once been a fence here, years ago, stretching in a wide curve around the south pasture. It had marked the edge of everything familiar. Now there was nothing to see. But the horse stopped anyway. She stood still, head lowered, ears slowly moving left and right, scanning the wind for sounds or scents. The cold air brought only the smell of soil, bark, and last year's leaves decomposing under the top layer of frost. She took one cautious step forward. The tall grass shifted around her legs. Then another step, slower. And then she halted. Below her hoof was wood, soft, rotted, buried beneath the growth. Not a branch, a rail. Half swallowed by time, but still there. She nudged it once, lightly, with the tip of her hoof. It moved, just slightly. This had been the old fence line. Back then, it kept her world enclosed, not by force, but by rhythm. Fields to run in, shadows to follow, a schedule of hay, water, rest. The boundaries were clear, but not cruel. Now, That edge had disappeared, but her memory hadn't. She looked to her left, where a corner post once stood. There was only a sunken impression in the grass, a depression where the ground had settled. Moss had overtaken it. A mouse had burrowed there. To her right, more grass. An old feeder lay collapsed, its iron legs twisted. A few sparrows perched on it briefly, then scattered at her movement. She stepped forward again, then paused. There was another scent on the air now. Not old, not from the past. Fresh. She lifted her head and turned into the breeze. It wasn't human, not dog. Cattle. Faint but unmistakable. The smell of hide and manure and damp breath. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere across the field beyond the hill. She listened. A low sound, not a bellow, but movement. Hooves in soft mud, grass being torn by teeth. She exhaled slowly. It wasn't a threat, but it was other. She hadn't seen cattle in years. Not since the neighboring field was sold, and the barn there collapsed. Yet the scent lingered now, proof that things had returned, changed. She stood in place for a long while. The grass shifted gently. A breeze passed, catching strands of her mane. Above, a single hawk cried again, circling wide. She did not go toward the cattle, not yet. Instead, she turned slightly away from the hill and stepped back across the buried fence line. She walked slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because the memory in her hooves still told her this was a border once. Even if the wood had rotted, even if the field had forgotten, she had not. By midday, the sun had risen high and bare above the pasture. There were no clouds, no breeze, and for the first time in days, the frost had fully retreated from the grass. In its place remained only stillness, the kind that stretches long across open ground and leaves no place to hide. The horse moved slowly through the brightness. Her coat, thick with winter fur, clung to her in the rising warmth. Flakes of old hair hung loose around her shoulders. She shook her neck once, not to rid herself of flies, there were none, but as if to shake off something older. There were no shadows in the field now, only the flattened light of early afternoon, where every object lost its edge, and the contours of things became difficult to define. Even the fence line was gone. Here, in the center of the field, the ground was flat and wide. Once it had held a long wooden lean-to, a shelter from summer heat, where several horses would stand flank to flank, ears flicking, eyes half-lidded, at ease in the deep shade. It was gone now, nothing left but 4 short square stones in the grass where the beams had rested. The horse passed between them. She didn't stop, but her gait shifted, just slightly. Her hooves struck the ground with more weight, slower, as though her body recognized something her mind no longer needed to recall. Here she had dozed. Here she had rested beside others. Names didn't matter. Time had worn them down. But the warmth of presence lingered, the sense of flank beside flank, of breath rising and falling, of heat shared not from cold, but from belonging. Now, she was alone, but not abandoned. The field itself held her, not with fences, not with ropes, but with memory in the soil. Birds flew low overhead, a flicker of starlings, then silence. Far across the pasture, a single white butterfly moved from weed to weed, wings barely rising in the warm air. The horse stopped near a patch of dried thistle. She lowered her head but did not graze. The grass here was brittle, tired. She stood motionless instead, eyes half closed, ears moving only occasionally. Not asleep, just still. It was a kind of waiting, a kind of listening. For what, she didn't know. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps the echo of hooves no longer present, the smell of sweat on another's shoulder, the feel of deep shade. But there was no shelter now, and the sun did not cast shadows. Still, the field remained, and so did she. By late afternoon, the light began to shift. Not yet sunset, but the sun had lowered just enough to bring back contrast. Long angles stretched across the field, and the land's edges returned. Grass that had seemed flattened under the midday brightness now lifted again, catching shadows beneath its blades. And with the returning depth came motion. The horse stood near the southern edge of the old pasture, where the boundary once met the neighboring land. There had been a fence here, too, stronger than the rest. Once reinforced with barbed wire, it had separated properties, not just paddocks. But now, like the others, it was mostly gone. Still, her body remembered. She didn't cross immediately. Instead, she stood with her neck extended, nose slightly forward, tasting the scent carried in the wind. Other animals, cattle, several. Their smell was heavier now, clearer than before, mixing earth, fur, and dried mud. Their movement could be felt as much as heard. Dull footfalls in soft ground, the occasional low grunt, and the rhythmic sound of chewing. The horse stepped forward. Where the fence had once stood, only 3 metal posts remained, tilted and bent, strands of wire dangling between them like loose threads. The space between was open, wide enough to pass, but she paused. She didn't fear the cattle. They were not predators, nor competitors, but they were foreign to this place, not in the way of danger, in the way of difference. The air shifted again. Another scent joined, one she hadn't smelled in years. Diesel, oil, iron, a water tank, freshly filled, and near it, likely a trough. She stepped across the opening slowly. No noise, no hesitation in her feet. But her body held alertness. Ears turned forward, eyes scanning for more than shape, for signs of change. Just beyond the old fence line, the grass grew thicker, greener. The soil had been turned recently, likely tilled or trampled under hoof. Tracks crisscrossed the ground, not just from cattle, but from machinery. The smell of rubber still clung faintly to the earth. She moved carefully between tufts of grass, each step angled to avoid soft pockets of churned soil. Then she saw them. 6 cattle stood near the far end of the open field. Heavy-bodied, brown and white, ears tagged, heads lowered. One looked up as she approached. Not startled, just watching. The others followed. None moved toward her, but they noticed. She slowed, then stopped a good distance away. This was not her pasture. She had known that the moment the fence gave way to grass. But even so, she remained. The cattle did not challenge her, nor did they accept her. They simply observed. So she stood there, in the quiet gap between past and present, between memory and occupation, where the scent of wood and wire still clung to the soil, but no longer meant anything. The sun slipped lower, and for the first time all day, her shadow stretched long behind her, across the broken boundary she had just crossed. By the time the sun dipped low behind the hills, the sky turned a cool amber, and the light that reached the ground filtered sideways through the grass. Each blade cast a thread-like shadow. The pasture was quiet, not silent, but hushed in the way open land becomes when day begins to retreat. The horse stood near the center of the clearing. No more fences, no lean-to, no boundary, just earth. Her hooves had left shallow impressions in the soft soil. Not deep enough to last through rain, not deep enough to scar, just visible for now. Marks that would fade by morning. The land here did not hold memory in walls or stones. It remembered in the ground, and even then, only briefly. She lowered her head once more and nibbled at a patch of grass, not out of hunger, but ritual. The motion itself had become part of her rhythm, as familiar as breathing. Then she stopped and listened. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once. A reply came, far off, weaker. Wind stirred just enough to move her mane. It passed beneath her, lifted, then carried on, as though pushing gently past her into the open field. She shifted her weight. Beneath her hoof, the earth compressed. There was no sound, not really, but the feeling was real. The soil gave way with a softness that held stories, of rain and hooves and footsteps, and all the animals that had passed this way long before her. She moved again, slowly. Each step made a slight press, a small imprint. Nothing dramatic. But the ground felt it, and in turn, she felt something back. Not physical, but present. a kind of agreement between body and land. You are here. You have passed. You will go. The sun touched the horizon. Shadows stretched again across the clearing, long and quiet. Her body cast a shape that reached across the grass, merging, fading, returning. Then, with no sign, she turned toward the slope. No destination, no urgency, just motion. Her hooves struck the soil once more. The field, patient and wide, accepted the sound and held it. Not forever, not loudly, but just long enough to know that she had walked here,